This morning, our homily is from Father John and will be read to us by Eddie. Eddie, please.
Actually, it's Jane,
Jane, okay, Jane.
I think. Today's Jeremiah text is one of the richest in Hebrew scripture. However, its talk of a new covenant as the Spirit's direct impression upon the hearts of believers serves also as the justification for certain Gnostic, Protestant, and evangelical claims. These claims rest upon the principle of direct spiritual governance of one's soul, mind, and heart, and of one's conscience outside institutional hierarchical authority. Needless to say, this text is fraught with dangers arising from self deifying absolutes, as when cult leadership projects messianic mandates upon its followers. Nevertheless, in voicing their understanding of Jesus, this Jeremiah text was used extensively by Paul and the gospel writers, as well as the author of today's reading from the letter to the Hebrews. The Jeremiah text is astonishing. It is revolutionary. Nowhere else in Hebrew scripture do we have the likes of this prophetic teaching, namely, that God's self revelation will need no mediation, no translation, no hierarchical intervention. This covenant will create a new human self in which God's teaching will come to mind and heart directly, free from external dictates. We know that most institutional churches skirt this prophetic utterance, understandably. Jeremiah is declaring that a new interior covenant of God's making transcends hierarchical governance, both morally and doctrinally. Juxtaposed to this democratic news, according to Jeremiah, otherwise known as the prophet of doom and gloom, is today's gospel, opening with a carefully constructed hierarchical protocol to Jesus' monologue. Greek worshippers approach Philip and ask to see Jesus. Instead of going directly to Jesus, Philip goes to Andrew, Peter's brother, and together they go to Jesus with the request. Keep in mind that this gospel attributed to John is a late development, over 100 years after the death of Jesus. Already it is evident that this Christian community has taken on hierarchical structures, reflecting the institutions of the societies in which they lived. The gospel writer has Jesus speak as one of their own spiritually mature elders might speak. He speaks with theological sophistication, serenely self confident, and all knowing. Jesus speaks as would the fully realized Christ. He speaks a catechetical summary, prerequisite for the inquiry to see him, that is, to know him. He does not directly address the Greek request. Rather, he speaks to Andrew and Philip, as would a distant Max von Sydow, portraying Jesus as an overstarched interpretation of the Messiah. This gospel monologue, cast in catechetical formulae for teaching the Hellenic world in its search for wisdom, is a typical Johannine setup for a theological exposition. In this gospel construct, we have a corollary, if not a juxtaposition, to Jeremiah's prophetic new covenant. If anyone trusts in following the sacrificial pattern of Jesus' life, then access to him will lead to the seeing of him desired. That is, to believing in Jesus as the Christ. Gospel testimony is saying that Jesus is seen not so much in visions and in ecstasies, but by the way of service at the cost of self-interest. It is only in his dying and rising that Jesus as Lord becomes accessible to the Gentile world. The writer of this gospel is saying that there is no immediate access to the Christ. He then compares a scenario in which Jesus does not rise to greet the Greeks who come seeking him. Jesus is thought to be a Byzantine emperor, firmly seated on the throne of governance. In not rising to meet them, Jesus is not dismissing or making light of their sincerity in wanting to see him. Rather, while this reasoning typifies the Greek way of knowledge, it will not lead the mind, still less the heart, for entering the mystery of the Christ, as does faith. Seeing Jesus crucified holds the revelation of wisdom. Therein is the glory of God, manifest in the Christ as a saving event. One last observation on the gospel text. Just as certain hierarchical protocol is demonstrated by the Greeks in approaching the disciple Philip, and he, in turn, mediating the request to Andrew, so Jesus' grand theological response, as directed to the disciples, indicates their mediational authority to evangelize the Hellenic world already at the gates of conversion. However much the hierarchical institutionalization of the Johannine community, accessibility to the mystery of the Christ calls for personal identification with the suffering servant. Only in looking upon Jesus crucified are we, along with the whole of humanity, able to see him as the Christ, the promise of a new covenant in which the whole of creation is awash in God's glory and taken up in the Easter of the universe. Amen.